I'm going to talk about two topics today because um, there won't be a class. No, we're not going to meet on Thursday. It's a holiday, so we need to cover up, and also um, we need to uh, tackle all the topics that we missed out because initially I was not able to meet you regularly. So our first topic for today is about site selection. Okay, so I reviewed some of the base maps that were submitted, and I think I need to comment on each one. So expect to receive a video commentary individually about it because I think it is more um, more effective that way rather than me giving a commentary about the submissions of the class in general. So which means making only one commentary for applicable to everyone because some people might think that they does not apply to them when in fact it does. No? Anyway, site selection. So it says here that the sequence of events, programming before site selection or site selection before programming may be interchangeable. Okay. But regardless of this, the site planner must ultimately adapt the program to the selected site. Okay. So in the end, the site gives the reigns supreme. No? Sustainable and context-sensitive site planning requires a thorough understanding of the site suitability for the proposed program. So this analytical and creative process often begins with site selection and programming. So I showed this process earlier. Although we talk about the physical, biological, and cultural attributes, we did not really, we're actually going back to the site inventory and site analysis. So the very first step is really site selection and site programming. Now, the site selection process has 6 steps. Okay, first is to clarify project objectives and requirements, then to determine the site selection criteria, then identify potential sites, evaluate each site suitability, rank the alternative sites, select the best site and document the results, and finally test the project feasibility. Now, the first 2 steps belong to the pre-planning stage, and then the rest of the steps belong to the data collection and analysis stage. We are going to go through each of the steps. No? First is to clarify project objectives and requirements. Um, so the client actually initiates the project. So it is very seldom that the architect initiates a project, although it is possible. Imagine that if a client, for example, is a friend or maybe an acquaintance, and you're aware that the client has a property and so far he has no plans to develop it, or maybe he's looking for ideas. So you can actually present an idea, you can make a proposal. Um, so in that case, it's the architect who actually initiates the project. Once the client approves it, so the ownership of the idea goes to the client, and the client takes over. But that is seldom the case. Okay, in that case, the architect will of course charge services for the proposals. But the normal course of action is that the client initiates the project. So the clients could include public agencies, government, um, non-government organizations, and private businesses. So these are your possible clients. Of course, it's easier to deal with private businesses and most difficult to deal with government, especially that government is very strict on documentation. Um, okay, so they're so strict that some expenses might not even be considered valid, and you will and you end up actually paying first for the services, then they reimburse you. But then again, they might not reimburse you for some expenses which you think are valid, but actually does not fit in their very strict plantilla, no, or their format. Project objectives among these different clients can vary widely. Um, these are examples only of possible objectives, although the goals here are very broad. For example, especially if the client is a government, so or actually these are applicable to all of those three. No? Habitat restoration and enhancement could be one goal, and we're talking about wetlands, prairies, forests, riparian. So even natural systems like this are planned. Okay, but what do we mean by planned? So in this case, we plan whether we will allow people to live, and if so, what would be the role of those people living, and what are the limitations that they have to follow. Because example, if it's a protected area, and then there's an existing community, so the community, you cannot just remove people. It's not that easy. And if it is really that difficult, so you'll have to work with them so that the people living there takes care of the land which is supposed to be protected. And you can tell them that, okay, the population has to be just this. Now, if someone marries, so the new couple has to move somewhere else, not in this house. So that's one way, you know. Um, there's a question from John. How does an architect get involved in a government project? Um, normally, it's a the government normally has a bidding process. Okay, they have they have a bulletin. They advertise whoever wants to bid on this project can bid, so the architect can bid. Okay, but then if you already know someone in government, uh, another option is that uh, they might select you, okay, and invite you to bid, because in the government it's always bidding. They're required always to have three sources, and then to select which is the cheapest, and then they go for that. Um, but then some governments, especially if the architect or the expertise is very difficult to find. For example, in LGU, you're the only one specializing on, say, a hospital project or the designs of hospital, and there's no one else capable. So the government can make an excuse or make a justification, not an excuse, a justification why they go directly to you. Okay. Um, otherwise, they would have to invite some other architects from outside of the LGUs. Um, and there are also those what we call fixed bid. Uh, these are like they invite someone else, but those someone else are actually like dummies. Okay, so this is actually happening in the industry, not only in government but even in non-government and private sector, because they're already confident about your expertise, but then they have to follow the procedure. So, okay, just to comply with the procedure, so they invite someone else with an agreement that these people will bid, although they will ultimately lose, and so they can be sort of compensated for that service. Okay, so I'm not saying that that's the way to go. It's not normal, but so far that's been happening. Okay. Um, so there are many goals and more, and each goal can differ. No? It depends on the project really. So it's the client who tells you what they really want to happen, and as architect and planner, um, it's your duty to make sure that they get what they want, but also you have to educate the client because sometimes they might ask for something which is not possible or maybe detrimental to them. So you being the expert, so you have to give good advice. Okay, so next is to determine the site selection criteria. So each project program generates site requirements that must be met. For example, minimum parcel size. So here we're talking about a bigger, an urban plan, no? Because you're talking about lots, different lots. But so far in your case, in your level now, you're you're thinking only of what goes inside one property. But proximity to transportation and utilities is something that has to be considered, suitability, suitable soils. So once the site selection criteria are established, alternative sites can be identified, evaluated, and compared before selecting the preferred site. So you have to draw first the criteria. What would I need for the site? Okay, what will I look for? And then there are many possible um, uh, criteria that you can uh, list down, and they're categorized. At least the author of the book, which should serve as our main reference, categorize these to site conditions, contextual factors, and project cost and benefits. Um, so in terms of site condition, we're looking at topography, soil, geology, vegetation, and hazard, and some legal and regulatory items like easements and zoning. What we would really want to know as a criteria is whether this site provides adequate condition or substrate for the project. For example, in terms of topography, will there be so many percentage of buildable uh, lot or buildable area in this property? Or is it all unbuildable or only 10% and you require like 40%? Uh, so what is unbuildable? Because if the slope is too steep, so that's unbuildable. So that's one way, no? Or soil, no? Or is the your criteria might be 30% or maybe the whole property should have such type of soil like uh, what no um, silty clay type of soil, but then the area only has what all limestone, coral, and very difficult to dig. So you need special equipment because it's very tough. So again, that this disqualifies the site. And easements, for example, okay. So the criteria is the criteria might be there is no future or there is no road, no, future plans for a road traversing the property. Because we mentioned about that last time, that if you consider a site, make sure that you also consider the projected plans of the government, whether they're going to expand the road right in front of you or something else. So when it comes to contextual factors, we're talking about market or service area, or physical condition like access to utilities, energy, water, access to services, and all of this. And what we are actually looking for is the proposed project compatible with the surroundings. Okay, so especially about access to transportation, whether okay the project is supposed to be near or far from such and such transportation, or should it be visible, or should it be in a floodplain zone or away from it? Okay, so these are so you have to set. So there is so the criteria can differ on the needs of the programs. And finally, project costs and benefits, which ultimately ask the question: does the project benefit outweighs its cost? Okay. If building in this site will cost so much, um, is it something that is acceptable or expected or that can be tolerated? Or do you need a site where the building cost is lesser? No? Because we're talking not only about cost of construction, there's also the permits involved. Say, I remember that in here in Davao City, I read a news about how San Miguel Beer um, found that if they locate in Davao City, they will ultimately earn so much income. But then the taxes in Davao City is so much that they don't think it's feasible. So what they did is they looked for a site which is just outside the border of Davao City. So if this is the border, so they relocated just beside it. So they now belong to another LGU where the tax is lesser, and so that they can operate, but their actual market is just beside them. So the Davao City. So it's a very wise decision. No? And there's also operation and maintenance cost. If it is very far, so you have to spend more on transportation. I don't know, you may have to house your employees or spend on um, bringing the utilities all the way to your site, okay, because the government does not have plans yet. So you have to do it privately, at least your client. No? So site suitability is largely a function of the site's capacity to provide the condition necessary for the proposed uses. So the capacity of the site to sustain the proposed uses or activities includes the following: physical conditions and legal conditions. We actually already um, mentioned that earlier. No? So the next step is to identify potential sites. So first you have the program. You develop the objectives of the client. Next, you come up with the criteria based on those objectives. So, what do you really need? What do you look for in a site? And then you try to look for potential sites. Okay. Now, site planning projects come about in one of two ways. Either a client may already own one or more sites, and the future uses of the land have yet to be determined, or the project objectives have been determined and a site must be found to accommodate those objectives. Okay, so I mentioned about earlier, no, about the architect knowing that the client have land, or in this case, lands, so more than one, and then there's no plan yet what to do with them, or there can be a plan to build something, and the client may have the land already or the lands already, or if not, they they can look for other lands which the client does not yet own. Okay, or it's a combination. So ultimately, the goal is to look for the most suitable site. So consequently, site selection involves one of two course of action: selecting a site from two or more non-contiguous sites, or selecting a site from within a larger contiguous parcel, possibly already owned by the client. So regardless of ownership, so it's either the two sites are near each other or they are far apart. So it's simply that, no? Um, because it can happen that you the lot is very big, say 90 hectares, but then you only need 10 hectares for this development. But the question is, in that 90 hectares, where are you going to place your 10 hectare? So you're going to analyze the site, no? So that you can hone into that portion where you're going to build. And then I think this is the fourth. Fourth is to evaluate each site suitability. So here is now where um, we grade each site. No? There are many ways of grading or rating a site. It's either a qualitative or nominal rating scale. You can grade this acceptable, somewhat acceptable, and this is referring to each criteria. Example, criteria number one, site one, it's acceptable, and site two, somewhat, and site three, unacceptable. Or you can use quantitative rating. Favorable, you use plus one, neutral, zero, and then unfavorable. So this should be negative one. Or another way of quantitative rating, but with five classes. So it's like a Likert scale from 0 to 4, with 4 as excellent and 0 as unacceptable. So you're really more detailed in your analysis. And then it's best to first have what we call threshold criteria, especially if you have so many lands to or so many sites to select from. Okay, so first you have to sort of come up with a short list, okay, or a short list of sites. So maybe you're considering um, 6 sites, but then you wanted to focus only on three, okay. So the shortlisting is done with this threshold criteria that if they don't pass this first test run, so you do not need to investigate in detail. So you remove already the rest. Um, and then that test can be one question or it can be so many. So if it's one question, maybe when the client says, architect, basta dili sa kanang bahaon na lugar. Okay, so if you have like 6 sites, so you are going to evaluate them according to this, and maybe say um, only those with ratings 3 and 4 can pass. Okay, so if the site is floods routinely 0, then okay, remove. Okay, so that makes it easier rather than go through all the process for each. This is an example of this from the book, you know, how they try to evaluate one site, and the site happens to be one site but divided into two. So the question is whether the property should be developed on the west side or on the east side. So that's why this is done this way. There are many ways, of course, to show, okay, the evaluation. You can do it in a tabular way, a graphical way, or a combination. This is like combination because the map is even placed on the table. And then making use of symbols like instead of numbers. Okay, so in the end, I don't know how the architect would finally choose this. Maybe they'll count the number of pluses and stars. Okay, so the more stars and plus signs, then the better. In scoring, if you're dealing with numbers, so there are many ways of going about it. One is that there's no weight involved on each criteria, so you just add everything up. Okay, add up all the scores and then total, and then the one with the most score, with the biggest total, wins. Another one is you set criteria. For example, the criteria for site um, can be like 20%, and then for anything about the context can be 40%, and etc. No? So what you do now is that you have the weighted scoring. So this X is the score, and then the W is the weight for that score. No? And then so it's like getting the grade, like what we do here in our class. Say your project is 40%, and then your quizzes are like, I don't know, 30% and 20% for something else. So this is a example of how weights can be given to the project. The multiplier can be in percentage, or it can be just an integer like this. So you multiply it by 5, by 4, or 3, depending on. and then the total score is counted. Okay, so the one with the bigger score wins. Regardless of which approach is taken, the site must be ranked or at least divided into groups of sites with similar suitability ratings and placed in one of the following four categories. So it's either preferred site, acceptable, high risk, least reasonable site. So um, sometimes you might think that, okay, after selecting a site, why do I have to present the other sites to my client? Okay. Um, it's because when you were doing the site selection process, you actually spend on the process. Okay, it's part of the cost. So to justify why you spend so much, so you should show um, the other sites that uh, you were considering, and then you ultimately scored them, so the client will realize, okay, so there is a thorough study being done here, and this justifies the expense. Okay, because for example, if your client is really very meticulous and looks over the books, you might ask, why do you have to travel this place and that place and spend so much time there and so much money there if your site that you're recommending is right over here? Okay, so that's why you have to explain. You have to include that in the presentation. So you select the best site and document the results. Of course, so after evaluating each site, so you ultimately end up selecting one. The type of client and project determines who has decision-making authority to select sites for further study. And public projects usually have a site selection process that encourages public participation. So the main question when it comes to selection is who selects? Okay, uh, you as an architect, and a planner, or the client as the owner, or is there someone else involved? Actually, you as the architect and planner can only recommend. And that's why you have to show the other choices because the client can still choose what you're not recommending. Okay, because you have your own analysis, but then the client might have his own ideas also, and these ideas, and you cannot blame them for not telling you about it earlier because some ideas come up during the presentation itself. Okay, so maybe it's something at the back of their minds which they think were not important before, but during your presentation it came out and they think that it is worth looking into. So there's a new set of criteria, and then they're doing the processing themselves, and then they select a site which you did not recommend and which actually falls maybe in one of these categories. No? Maybe you have your preferred site, but then they selected something from the acceptable sites. Like that. If the project involves a lot of people, so a lot of people will also be um, consulted. Okay, so selecting the site is not an easy process when the project becomes bigger, especially if it's government, because there is a mandatory public hearing. Okay, so you have to invite people who uh, who thinks that they are affected by this project. Okay, and then they come over in City Hall, and then there's a presentation, and then they ask questions, and then they raise objections, and you try to clarify all the objections, to settle the complaints, and then if things go well, so there's a decision. Otherwise, you go back to the drawing boards and try um, to answer all of those questions no, which were not answered satisfactorily. And so you come up with a report, and this is just a sample of a report, a format for the report with the title page, table of content, executive summary, um, and the rest. Um, okay. A site evaluation report is often prepared to summarize the site selection process and the result. The objective, once the best site is selected, is to secure the site, and there is often an option to purchase the land. Okay, because the site may not necessarily be owned by the client, so it might be owned by anyone, a government or public, and or it can be uh, what we call and there might be a need to do land banking, which is to buy small sites so that you can have the bigger site, no? Because it's made up of small properties. So that's why you have to buy all of those properties. Or for example, if you're actually considering only one big property, but in your study, it would be more advantageous for you if you also have this property at the other side or right beside it, but it's owned by private individuals. Okay, so one of the recommendation is to buy those properties. So, but in the end, is to secure the site, which means actually to make sure that the owner gets to own the land. Okay, so that's it for the first topic. Um, I have, well, if there are questions while I'm trying to go to the second one, to the second topic, no questions. Um, okay, so I'm going to share now the screen for our second topic. For those who came in late, um, I mentioned to those who came ahead that we will be talking about two topics today because there's no class on Thursday. So we're quite behind the our plan. No? Um, okay, so the next topic is about site programming. Okay, so I mentioned that site selection and site programming are the first, they're interchangeable, but I decided to just talk about site selection first. Okay, so let me see. Yeah, so we're still here in the stream left. So once a site is selected for development or redevelopment, its future uses can be determined or programmed in detail. Okay, so there's that initial programming when you actually did um, identify the objectives and then set the criteria. But now that the site is there, so more detailed programming is needed. So the preliminary program is revised and refined as more information is acquired about the site and the future users' needs and preferences. So the preliminary program is the one I mentioned earlier. So the program is expressed in terms of the quantity and quality of spaces needed to meet anticipated future needs. Um, so we're talking now about numbers, more numbers. Programming also occurs over a range of spatial scales from the entire site down to individual buildings on the site. Okay, so if we're programming for a building, we're talking about rooms. Um, but if we're talking about a site, we're talking about zones and building structures. Okay, so what are the programming methods? One is consultation only. Um, According to this author, um, the programming can start with the initiation of the project and then development of project mission and objective, which is part of pre-programming we mentioned earlier. And then this might be refined, or if not, then we go to the third step, determine the project's operational and physical requirements. And finally, to document and present the program to the client. But in doing this, all you need to do, one way is just to consult, which means to talk to the client, to sit down with the client and then do a checklist. No? Determine project's operational and physical requirements. So if this were a building only, uh, not a site planning, not site programming. So what you do is that you just take note of what are the user behavior the moment they enter the building until the moment that they leave. You trace the activity, the flow, and then you make sure that there is a space for each activity. For example, okay, they go in and then they have to get rid of their bags. So that means that you have a locker, um, or locker room, and then if part of the flow is to take some snacks, etc., etc., so you need to put a pantry. So it's like that. But here we're talking about the bigger scale outside the building. Okay, at the moment someone enters the facility until the moment that they leave. So what do they do? What do they need? What are the physical requirements they need? The other one is that you actually collect data. So in the first procedure, the data is already available from the client and you just need to get it from him to interview. But here you need to do your own collecting of data. You can do this in many ways. These are not the only ways, but these are a few of the more common methods. You can do survey, analyze documents, observe behaviors, um, or visit the site, or, or go through literature uh, materials. Okay, but what data are you going to get based on those methods? Um, there are three categories of data that you will need to collect about the site and its context, then the user needs and the preferences, and then you also need to look for design precedents. That is why in the research in design 4, I realized that some of you are uh, it's either advanced in design or behind. I don't know. No? I think it's advanced. Or you've already finished design 4. Um, so this is the case studies, which we will describe later. When we talk about site and context, we're actually talking about um, all of these documents, which we already discussed before, no? Historic and current area photographs, zoning maps, road maps, soil survey maps, flood hazard maps, tax assessment maps. Um, so you determine what should be inventoried and analyzed, and then you clarify clients' expectations and determine opportunities and constraints. Um, I I just realized that although I have not gone through all of the assignments, but in the assignments that I already reviewed, I noticed that the maps, the base maps that you presented, um, I think there's a misunderstanding of sort of because most of you presented like a site inventory map, not a base map. So it's actually different because the base map only has the features, the physical features. In a zoning map, for example, so you have the map that shows all the zones. Uh, and then a road map shows you a map that shows all the roads. But if you're going to show a map that shows the vehicular access, the behavior of the vehicle, the pedestrian, so that's already a site inventory. Okay, that's not a base map anymore. It's like you use the road map to make an inventory of the vehicular access and the pedestrian access and anything that has to do with roads. Um, Soil survey maps shows you only the types of soils in the map, but in a site inventory, you might include there the constraints. For example, this is difficult or whatever. No? This is a very hard surface, etc. This is dangerous here. It can slip away, etc. So you put notations. So that's a site inventory. So there's a difference between a base map and a site inventory map. So far, we've supposed to have covered the base map, and where we will be covering the site inventory map next week. Okay, so it's good that this confusion came out so that we can really make sure that it's delineated, that you know the difference between the two. When you get the user needs and preferences, you need to identify who the users are. Okay, so the diagram I'm showing here is actually taken from the CLUP guidebook. CLUP stands for Comprehensive Land Use Plan. So it's really a very, very big, it's a document for a big scope. No? We can be talking about regions or provinces or cities or municipalities. But that's why here, I think this is, I don't know. But right now we're talking about a particular property, one site. But you still need to identify the stakeholders for that site, okay? Because the owner alone, whatever his plans are, would ultimately affect those around him. So they should be consulted also. So identify stakeholders by key planning and development sectors or coverage, like you say in terms of um, say neighborhood or in terms of economic activities uh, who are affected, in terms of operations who are affected. So you just try to, this is work on between you and the client. Then you prepare an action plan for approaching and involving each person or group. So which is the best way to approach so that you are not turned away violently, and develop and implement an information education campaign. Okay, so after approaching them and getting their preferences, it's good to make friends with them. Okay, and how do you make friends with them? You feed them information that they would especially like to hear. Okay, like good news. And then so that na our own dialect, maingganyo sila. So this is a very tedious operation, but if you can do this, then better. Otherwise, it would simply be just your client and you talking and then just involving a few people whom your client thinks is important. And for the third, the design precedents. So you're going to collect um, following information. These are just samples. Program uses and requirements, including the needs of special user group, for example, children, the chronically ill, the elderly, spatial organization, articulation of buildings, circulation systems, and open systems. That's why in the research, I ask you to do case studies of similar projects and okay, so how did they organize the spaces, or how do they consider special needs like children and elderly, and how do they respond to the sites, the contextual factors. No? If, for example, the project is in Batanes, which is the northernmost part of the Philippines, where all the possible typhoons of the Philippines would really drop by and say hi. No? How do you build there? So you look at the site and then you notice that there are buildings existing. So the question is, okay, so what did they do to survive? Then you learn from them. Okay. Techniques for protecting and restoring environmental and cultural resources. Okay. So you're going to build in a cultural heritage zone. It's very strict. And then you wanted to go modern, but then how can you compromise? And then you look at the site, the vicinity, and you see another new building which is trying to, which is also modern, but they passed, no, the passed the requirements of the LGU. So you ask, what did they do? Okay, how did they get away with it? So you try to learn from the experience of others. Okay, so you do not need to reinvent the wheel. So that's the main idea here. Why you have to search for design precedents. Okay, um, because if possible, you try to improve. Okay, so they already did this, and you get it, you adapt it, and then you improve. In this way, you actually contribute to the design. Okay, and finally, I think finally, project documentation. Um, so you should be able to write things down. This is the same as the site selection. You should be able to write things down. Because anyway, when you're going to bill your client, you need to send, you give something, no, that tells the client that you actually did work. Okay, so it's like, okay, what's the output? Normally, there's an output given so that they, for the exchange of money. And so this, the output is a written program of requirements, which states or specifies the amount of space required for the proposed activities, the desired adjacency relationships among the activities, the phasing of future implementation, because the project may be implemented by stages. So the expected qualities of the spaces and the structures within the project. So just last night I was watching the video about the headquarters of Apple and how they presented it, no? So that in the property they actually have not only this ring but also other buildings. So note that open space is also a program element. Okay. So I mentioned earlier that if this were a building, we'll be talking about rooms. But since this is a site that we're trying to program, so open spaces are considered like a room, okay, a program element. And then there are meaningful spaces that facilitate groundwater infiltration, provides visual amenities, and recreational facilities. So um, you might need um, to allocate space where water can seep through, you know, the soil to recharge the aquifer below. Okay, so there's an open space, so not everything should be paved with cement. Then you should have some spaces for landscaping only for people to enjoy, or spaces for recreation. So depending, it could only be a small playground or maybe a sports facility, or protect wildlife habitat. So if this is a very big property, so there's a property which you reserve for some wildlife. Okay, so people don't go there, or even if people go there, at least the animals are not disturbed. They have their own habitat. This is a similar to the ones you did in design. At least another way of actually putting it. Um, there is a program criteria here. There's a type. I forgot to put the legend what O and P and WS means and what all of this mean. So there's number of staff, number of units, and NSF. Anyway, so this is it could, your program can be presented in tabular form like this one. Functional relationships. Okay. Um, this actually refers to what we call the proximity matrix. I think another term that they use is adjacency diagram. And then if you notice here, there are four criteria. Adjacency is essential. It is desirable but not essential. Is unimportant and should be avoided. Those under me in design might be surprised why I recommend using only three. Okay, it's because you have not gone through. I considered you as like beginner designers. So we start with something simple, and then when you already get the habit, so you can now add a uh, fourth dimension. No? That's why I would recommend something essential, unimportant, and something to avoid, or just three. No? But then you can also go directly to four now that you have your planning background. Adjacency matrix, okay, that's what they call it, is a useful tool for summarizing and evaluating the desired spatial relationships among programs and elements. And it says here that when programs are complex, the assessment of spatial relationships among program elements can be achieved by a bubble diagram. So in your case, you required both proximity matrix and bubble diagram. In some projects, only the uh, proximity matrix or adjacency matrix is enough. But then if it becomes complicated, so you may either have both or you can just have the bubble diagram. And it says here that the bubble diagram portrays the desired spatial or functional relationship between the targeted land use, which you will put in the center, the other program use, which we will put all around. Um, this is an example of a bubble diagram when we talk about the site. Okay, so in a bubble diagram, the relation of each space is already considered. And then in a site, especially, it's already indicated where the zones should be. So you know where the woodland will be placed, where the school, there will be a building there, a play area, the sports area, there will be some buildings there, and so all of this, no? And then, um, so from the main entrance, there should be a direct link towards the school and towards the center and also towards the other side. Okay, so you have the trees, pedestrian access. So this is how you do it. And when the clients look at it, um, they can actually understand, even if it's just sketches. So imagine the bubble diagram that you've been making. They're like abstract paintings for clients, no, with all of those bubbles going there and arrows, and they cannot relate. So you have to make sure even that even diagrams are relatable. And finally, you make what we call design guidelines. Okay. So far, the document that we are talking about is the program, which is tabulated. So it's like your uh, space requirements, a furniture requirement, like the one that you make in your design. And then you have the proximity or adjacency matrix or bubble diagram and or. And then finally, a design guideline. Okay. Um, Design guidelines are not site-specific solutions to a project's design problems. So there are like strategies that are applicable to any sites, which you decide to apply to your site. Okay. They typically portray the desired qualities of design solution. They include stormwater drainage and infiltration techniques, street dimensions and parkings. For example, street dimension and parking lot configuration doesn't have to mean that this is exclusive for your site, custom made for your site, okay? Because actually it applies to all. In fact, you can find it in the graphic standards, you can find it in the National Building Code. But then you specify which of the plethora of um, street designs you would like to use for this. So in one avenue, for example, you can divide it into sections, like if you're going to put a bike lane or a pedestrian, how wide is your pedestrian? If you're going to put planter, okay. So there are standards for this. So you just select. Um, Design guidelines can be communicated with text and numbers, but graphic representations are more effective. Of course, when we talk about designs, no? For large public institutions and corporations, creating or maintaining a particular image or brand is typically a high priority use. So, especially for companies, so there has to be that branding. So you have to select design guidelines which will feature some of the um, images of the company. Take for example, um, right now all I can think of is a historical district. No, in Japan, um, last Friday in my class in architectural conservation, I showed a picture of a street in Japan that leads to a castle, and that street is very important because um, it's normally the main street going to the castle. And then that area along the street is also important because that's a district where all the samurais live. And that street is to be a very busy commercial district, even in the past. But now they wanted it to be highlighted as a tourism place, but then they cannot have the old buildings as is because there's so much modifications already. So the government decided to, okay, um, all the buildings fronting this street will be new, there will be commercial, and then if people wanted to really taste the local flavor or how the locals really built their houses. So they had to penetrate that line of new buildings because inside that will be the old buildings and then the street pattern is the old one. So only this street is new. But then they have other guidelines. So for example, the the design uh, should look like residences and should have all these elements, these colors, even even parking spaces, fences uh, looks like they're built from the old uh, period. Um, Another way is probably also in. I was wondering whether Cebu Business Park or Ayala, no, in Cebu, uh, actually did this because, for example, in your street signs, you can put their logo or you can use their color all throughout. And Lapu-Lapu tries to do this by painting everything with that pattern of no, more abstract patterns, colorful patterns. So this is an example. Uh, in the US, they have what they call the main street. Uh, you get a street and then this more of conservation, no? Especially if it follows the example that I just gave. If the architectural character is very specific on a period, so they wanted to maintain it, so they would probably require that, okay, for your structure should be arcaded this way, and then they should have this awnings and these varying roof lines, roof slopes, and shades, etc., etc. So you can also make that design guideline for your site. Okay, especially if the owner is not the only one who's going to build on the site. Okay, it's his property, but then there are cases when the property, even if it's commercial, the owner can just either put boxes of buildings and let the client come in and redecorate that building. Okay, or I mean, a tenant come in and redecorate that building. Um, or the owner can just put like SRP. So considering the big SRP property, uh, so there are many properties inside, so it can be leased out or even if sold. But then the owner of the whole property, of whole development, can still dictate what should be in this property. Okay. Um, in cases of subdivisions, they can dictate not only how the building will look like, even the cost. So the cost of the building should not be less than 3 million, for example. So that happens in, I think, Northtown Homes in Kabangkalan. We had a project there, and that's one of the parameters. And then another parameter is the height of the building. So I cannot forget that because we actually made a mistake. We were like 1 meter more than the required, and we were asked to chop off the roof, and it was impossible because the roof was already there. So we have to pay the fine. And then the Aboitises were the developer. They said that, oh, it's the fine is not going to be too much, but it will certainly hurt. So that's how they say it now. And then it's really fresh from my memory. We should not commit the same mistakes again. Okay. Okay, so that's it um, for the second topic. Um, so expect me to send you my individual commentary in video about your last uh, assignment. And for now, I don't have an assignment yet, although I'm thinking of asking you to select a site, to do a site selection exercise and programming. But I'll probably announce it in our next meeting next week. But aside from the video that I'm going um, to share with you individually about your submission, I will also be posting small quizzes. So in principle, I'm supposed to give you a quiz every topic, but I have not been able to do that. So I'm going to post them, which you can answer at your own time. So there's no deadline. Okay, but then you have to complete all the quizzes within the midterms period. I also decided to do away with the preliminary pre-midterm exam. So we only have the midterm exam as a major exam because of the delays. Okay, so those are the announcements. Okay, so it's been an hour. Um, any questions before we go? Yep. Some people have already started to leave, no? So that's it for now. And thank you for coming. Okay, goodbye.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.